Not long ago, I leveled up a Sorceress with a Frost Shatter playstyle, which was a ton of fun going through the campaign, and I shared that build that I ended up using in the lower endgame level maps in my Frost Chronomancer video. But many people said that the build was too slow or that it couldn't compete in higher tier maps. And while they weren't technically wrong because I was level 73 at the time and hadn't even seen later maps yet, that doesn't mean that this build wasn't capable of scaling up to them. Also, not every build needs to be the best at face rolling through swarms of mobs and maps, but for most people I think they want to play a viable but fun build that actually motivates them to grind the game long enough to reach endgame. And what's fun for me is snapping my fingers and seeing frozen enemies turn to dust. So if that sounds fun to you, then this is my updated Frost Chronomancer build, viable for endgame content. Personally, I get bored of maps after a while, and I think people overvalue them because they're the main endgame content currently, but there's definitely some value to being able to clear them faster and more efficiently because the breaches and delirium spawns need you to go fast. So I simplified the build to get out its damage faster, but mostly I enjoy doing the Trials of Sekima, or the Chaos Trials, which have a more strategic process rather than brute force way of playing them. And I feel like this build is definitely more suited for that. If you do just want to focus on maps, then you can just play this build with the Stormweaver Ascendancy, which gives more sustained damage, whereas Chronomancer is more burst and utility. Since I've already made a leveling guide for this build, I won't be going over the basics. I'll just post all the gems and stat priorities in the description of this video, and I'll be focusing mostly on the unique gear synergies and playstyle in this video. So the main idea of the build is to freeze enemies, do heavy damage while they're frozen, and then shatter them to finish them off. If you're killing low level mobs, then you might be able to just spam Frostbolt because it does decent damage and it also is our main source of freeze. One thing that is super useful is that Frostbolt travels further than you can see on screen, allowing you to freeze enemies safely from a distance or to preemptively cast your combo before engaging the enemy. But when enemies have a bit more life, you'll need more damage, so the basic combo involves using Frostbolt, Eye of Winter, and Cold Snap in that order. The Frostbolts are slow moving projectiles, so you can often cast multiple depending on the distance between you and the enemy. This should be the most used skill, so you'll definitely want to invest in that 4th gem slot for the Inspiration Gem, since this is such a key skill that you want to spam. Frostbolt also covers the ground with an ice surface that helps to add more freeze and to allow Eye of Winter to scale up, because when Eye of Winter travels over a surface, it gains extra damage and effects from that surface, essentially empowering Eye of Winter with even more freeze potential when we use it right after Frostbolt. Eye of Winter also applies critical weakness to enemies on hit, which increases the base critical chance of hits against that target, which means that all of your crits get scaled up way more than you think. Let's say you have a 100% increased crit chance. That increases your base crit by double, and most spells have around 10% crit, so you're ending up with around 20% crit chance because you increased it by 100%. But if you increase the scaling from 100 to 200, then you'll have 30% chance. Critical weakness, on the other hand, does not increase the scaling, it increases the base crit chance. So if you get to the cap of 10 critical weakness, which we can get easily by using the Unleash support gem, you'll increase the spell crit chance from 10 to 20%, and then you add on the critical chance modifier of 100%. Now you end up with 40% chance to crit, which is much better. Not only to add more critical weakness, but to give a chance to crit, because whenever we crit with the skill due to other support gems, we'll get cold exposure on our target, further increasing our cold damage. But since Archmage uses up a lot of our mana, don't max out the level of your Eye of Winter, since it's mostly there for damage modifiers, not actual damage, and it can cost a lot of mana. So Frostbolt and Eye of Winter help to get our damage modifiers from freeze and critical damage. Then we finish with Cold Snap, which is our highest damage ability when we can get a frozen target, or on the Frostbolt when it reaches the target. Frostwall is also really important for stopping enemies and dealing good damage when the icicles break. We can break them using our combo, or we can just place them on bigger enemies or bosses and they instantly break. This makes some bosses or rare mobs that are big enough to break the icicles instantly easier than most trash mobs. So it's really important to recognize which enemy models are large enough that you can just frostwall them for a free kill. Comet is also a key burst skill, and I use 2 instances of it. One I can manually cast on frozen targets, and the other is automatic from cast on free spirit gem. So Comet is mostly used to blast frost walls and frozen enemies for big bursts on bosses. And since I do more damage to enemies that are frozen, I want them to be frozen as long as possible before using Cold Snap on them, which would shatter the freeze and reduce my damage. So a more extended combo is to freeze the enemy using Frostbolt and Eye of Winter to apply critical weakness and frost exposure, then put up a frost wall, Comet to blast the frost wall, then put another frost wall and rewind to get your mana back, then Frostbolt and Cold Snap to end the freeze. Nothing but the strongest rares and bosses will survive that. And if they do, then there's the Time Freeze and Temporal Chains, because we're going deep into the Chronomancer tree for this. So go for the left side of the Hourglass first for the Rewind and Time Stop. Then if you manage to get your 3rd and 4th Ascendancy, you can go for the cooldown reset. But if you only have the 3rd Ascendancy point, then the random cooldown reset isn't reliable enough, so I go for the passive slow around you, which can help when you're getting swarmed. Now, Temporal Chains is a curse that makes debuffs last longer on the target, so this can make the freezes last longer, and your time freeze to give you even more time to do your combo on bosses. So really you should start your combo with Temporal Chains, then Time Freeze, Frostbolt and Eye of Winter, Frost Wall, Comet, Wall again, Rewind for mana, Frostbolt, and Cold Snap. But that's just how we get our damage, which is generally simple. We also need to survive because the endgame can be extremely savage and kill you instantly with no animation or time to react. And Path of Exile is extremely punishing, so playing a glass cannon is generally not worth it. So we have some extra layers to make us a steel cannon. I use the Mind Over Matter and Eldritch Battery passive combo, which lets us use our mana as health. And while this can be risky because you can be depleted of your mana very fast and be vulnerable, we have some safeguards like the Chronomancer's Temporal Rift to rewind time to regain our mana. Also, I have the Midnight Braid Rawhide Belt unique, which recoups 50% of damage taken, along with other passives that add mana recuperation from adverse growth. So when I take damage, I get 70% of that damage back in mana over the next 8 seconds. And since I use mana as health, it basically just sustains me so long as I don't get bursted before the recoup finishes. And that's definitely a problem because it takes 8 seconds for recoup to happen. But I can also rewind time to get the mana back that I lost when getting hit, and the recoup still occurs even though I rewinded the damage that triggered it. So I get to double dip on mana regeneration effects to stay really high on mana, which is much more safe while using the higher level spells with extreme mana cost. Also, if you use the Distilled Emotions green, purple, and yellow on your amulet, you can get Mental Toughness to reduce your mana costs, allowing you to stay high on mana in case you need to soak a big hit. It's extremely important to max out your resists because preventing one-shots is all you need to do to survive, because the mana regeneration you get is enough sustain to survive through any small amount of pressure. If you can afford to get a lot of mana, then it can be worth it to go for Chaos Inoculation, which makes you immune to chaos and puts your life to 1. And since we aren't using our life as a resource most of the time, this usually doesn't matter, at least until you get stun locked and lose all your mana. But this allows you to budget more of your stats into mana or other resistances because you don't need chaos resistance anymore. But I would only do this if you have at least 3,000 or 4,000 mana, as it makes you really squishy otherwise. The other nodes are either mana regeneration, freeze synergy, or damage modifiers. So how you get that much mana is getting it straight from your gear, from intelligence, and also energy shield, which converts to mana from Eldritch Battery. Don't go for energy shield in your passives, where it gives you a % of your energy shield. Only go for flat energy shield, since it doesn't scale before converting to mana. Then we want cold damage, spell damage, crit chance, and most importantly, plus to the level of spells or cold spells. Nothing increases your damage more than these because it increases your base damage greatly, and then all the % damage modifiers that you add to them go much further. But of course, this adds a lot of mana cost to your skills, so you need to find a good balance between having high base damage and keeping your mana high so that you don't instantly die. We also want some extra spirit because Archmage takes 100 spirit and Cast on Freeze takes 60, We want a Clarity gem as well for the mana regen, so that's 170 spirit that we want, which I get from the amulet and the chest piece. But I also want to use Blink, which takes another 60 spirit. And there's a nice shield that gives spirit on it called the Oakworn Sigil Crest Shield. Using this shield will drop your damage by a lot because it has no spell damage or anything along those lines, but luckily we don't need any of that to use Blink. So we can get a second weapon set to use the shield and another wand, or you can use a scepter in your offhand instead of the shield if you have the strength for it. But if we want all the mana we can get, then we want intelligence instead of strength. Then you can turn Blink on in your second weapon set, and you can have Temporal Chains or Comet to manually cast in your first weapon set. That way when you're doing your combo, you'll always be in your higher damage set. And if you want to use Blink for mobility, you can use the manual keybind for weapon swap, or you can use the Raise Shield keybind, then dodge to Blink. This lets you have Blink on demand without losing much damage because you can swap to the weapon that fits the situation, which is extremely important for adapting to different game modes such as the escape trial or avoiding boss mechanics that you can't just dodge away from, which will improve your survivability greatly against the one-shot attacks, so your mana can sustain you the rest of the way. Once you get the build going, you can do great damage to bosses with Frostbolt combos, stay mobile in dangerous situations with blinks and rewinds, sustain through swarms of enemies with freezes, slows, and walls to gain control. And if you want even more survivability, you can replace Blink with Blasphemy and put in the Enfeeble Curse to automatically pulse around you while on your shield set. And you can also block with your shield for even more damage reduction to give your mana some time to recoup before you get obliterated too fast. The most important thing to understand is that Frostbolt has a slow projectile speed, which gives you a lot of time to do other things before you need to interact with it. This means you can send out a ton of Frostbolts into a group of enemies, and then decide which Frostbolts you want to shatter as the encounter unfolds. Also, they move slow enough that you can run with them to ensure maximum value. Any enemies running at you will get hit by the Frostbolt because you're next to its hitbox and they're next to you. This lets you send out a bunch of Frostbolts right before you run into a group of enemies, then move towards the target while waiting for them to charge you. If they come at you, you can put an Eye of Winter on them and then shatter the Frostbolts as they reach, getting heavy freeze buildup very fast. Also, you can aim the Frostbolts away from the enemy and run with it. This way the chilled ground slows enemies for longer as you're running most of its surface area rather than shooting it at the enemy and then they just run through the entire thing. Watching your mana is also important because if it gets low due to spamming spells, you're in danger of being one-shotted. So you want to regularly rewind time to refund your mana, and the best time to do this is usually after your cast on freeze triggers or after taking any damage because those deplete your mana fastest. Besides one-shot mechanics, physical damage is your biggest enemy due to our lack of armor, so in situations where you need to survive, camp your shield weapon set and try to keep enemies at a distance with frozen ground from Frostbolts. And when you get swarmed during breaches or situations where you need to survive while also doing as much damage as possible, Frost Walls are the fastest and most effective defensive mechanism because not only does it block projectiles and prevent enemies from attacking you from all sides, but it also grants mana regeneration from the Mana Font gem and will kill enemies that try to break the walls. So put those down first, then start spamming your Frostbolts, and whenever your mana gets low, just rewind and put down the next walls and keep those Frostbolts going. Pop out an Eye of Winter when you can put it in the middle of a juicy combo, and doing that on top of bursting bosses is how I finish my tier 5 maps quest. So if you like the build and want more fun and effective Path of Exile 2 build guides, subscribe, and I'll see you all next time.